I suppose the reason why I'm in a bit of a rush to start is we're doing a double act today, myself and Sheree, and you know, when you put two academics together, you end up with 60 slides to try and fit into 40 minutes. So we've got lots of slides. We'll try our absolute best. The first thing I want to do is just introduce Dr. Sheree Bekker to you all. It's a bit of an interesting story where Sheree and I met. We're both South African, although Sheree doesn't sound like it anymore. I'm told that I still do. And we took fairly different journeys. Sheree started out her master's degree and then had an opportunity to go and study a PhD in Australia. And so she skipped the country, as they say in the classics, and went and spent some time at Ballarat University. We weren't aware of each other at the time, and then we ran into each other at a sports medicine conference in South Africa, and just met, didn't know that it was going to lead to anything. And then years later, once I was here, I was really struggling to write a paper which had to do with injury and injury prevention, and I just didn't have the words. And I read one of Sheree's papers where she spoke about complexity and how you can apply that lens to injury prevention. And I emailed her straight away and I said, look, you've got the language and the skills to help me with this. And we collaborated on that, and ever since then it's been quite a fruitful collaboration. So I'm really glad to have been able to get Sheree up here, and thank you, Sue, for facilitating that for us. And so I suppose we'll do a little bit of talking about what it is that we're trying to achieve. So with that, I'll hand the ball over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and yes, thank you for inviting me. It's really nice to be here. It feels slightly surreal to be here with another South African, but I mean, that's how research goes. And yes, so I really came to complexity theory because for me it is about having that language to explain things that we see all of the time in our research, particularly in injury prevention, but it is also applicable across a wide range of research areas. So today we're just going to give a bit of an overview of what complexity theory is, and so we'll just talk a little bit about firstly injury prevention programs, then understandings of complexity theory, and then we'll go into how that applies to different areas of research and the implications and considerations thereof. All right, so just a little bit of background. We'll start with injury prevention. I'll just give a little bit of background on that. That might be useful. So we know, as injury prevention researchers, we know that injuries are not an accident and that injuries are actually predictable and preventable events. So as injury prevention researchers, that is the role of what we're trying to do. We also know that every fifth injury in high-income countries is as a result of sport and recreation, so there's a really big burden of sports injuries in the world. So the thing that we're going to talk about today is a real bugbear of mine, because often in injury prevention research, but also in other areas of research, we tend to ask what works. So we tend to say, does this intervention work or not? But that really isn't a great question to ask, because as we know, it always depends. So this is like asking, does Team England win? Well, it really depends on the day, right, and the team that they're playing. So I'm going to give it over to Jason just to give a bit of a background on injury prevention research.
So, to follow on from that, what we see a lot in injury prevention research is that researchers develop interventions which they often impose in ecological environments, and they test their efficacy in those environments, and they come up with answers, and they say, yes, this intervention works. A really good example of this is the FIFA 11 Plus program, which has been shown in certain environments to reduce football injuries by 39%, and more recently for the rugby people in the room, Bath University has developed the Activate program, which has been shown to reduce match injuries by up to 72%. So that's really great, and in a lot of contexts, researchers feel like they've done their jobs. They go, well, we've given you a tool, there it is, now you go and use it. However, the other side of the coin, when you start looking a little bit more deeply, is that although we've got these injury prevention programs, injuries generally have, or or injury outcomes generally have completely ignored the fact that we've got injury prevention programs, because what we're seeing is more and more injuries. So this was recently published saying that over 13 years, since 2001, the rate of hamstring injuries has increased, even though there's been hundreds of publications about how to prevent hamstring injuries in professional football. And more recently, we see this, where there's loads and loads of efforts to reduce concussion in rugby, but the concussion injury incidence just carries on going up and up and up. So researchers have then said, well, we've given you the tools to sort out these problems. Why aren't you sorting them out? And they've gone and had a look at what's happening in these implementation environments. And what so specifically talking about hamstring injuries, so we know that hamstring injuries have been increasing in professional football over time. We've got some intervention programs related to particularly the Nordic hamstring exercise. And Roll Barr and colleagues went and investigated and found that 83% of clubs did not adopt that injury prevention program, even though they'd already showed them that it works. So that's the statement they put out there, and essentially this paper ended off by saying, well, what are you guys doing? We've sorted this out for you. Why don't you just get on with it? And similarly, the FIFA 11 Plus is often held up as a very, very efficacious injury prevention program. But when James and O'Brien went and investigated how it was used in clubs, what he found was that out of the 15 exercises within the program, typically a club used one exercise in the way that it was meant to be used, and used 4 others in modified form, and left out the rest. So what we can see is that there's this massive tension here between the way injury prevention interventions are developed, and the researchers say that they should be used, and then what actually happens in practice. And that's really the space that we're trying to target, is what happens between this research and practice. So how do we get more agreement? How do we make these injury prevention programs a little bit more usable potentially? And this is really where I probably pass the buck back to Sheree, because she's far more eloquent than me at explaining these things. But simply to say that potentially the problem is that injury prevention is complex, and that we are providing relatively simple solutions in terms of saying, well, here we go and do this, it's going to sort out all of your problems. And that is why the uptake in these environments has not been all that good.
Okay. So what I'm going to talk about first is, we'll talk today about what complexity is, and the easiest way to explain complexity is really to talk about what it is not, and that's the easiest way to understand what complexity then really is. So the paper that I'm going to be discussing today is this one that was published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. It's a short 800-word paper, just bringing this idea to injury prevention research. So as Jason has said, I am very much an implementation science researcher, so my work lies in this gap between research and practice, and how to bridge this gap. And what I was really finding when I was doing my work is that the way that our interventions are set up are often quite simple interventions, and yet the context that we then implement them into are really quite complex. But I didn't have the language to explain the difference between those two, and that's how I came to complexity theory. So let's talk a little bit about what complexity is and what it isn't. And the easiest way to think about that is to compare and contrast simple, complicated, and complex interventions or approaches or outcomes. So those are the 3 things that I'll talk about first. So let's talk a little bit about what a simple approach is. And the easiest way to understand what a simple approach is if we liken it to baking a cake. Okay, so baking a cake is usually quite simple. We have a recipe, we have inputs and outputs, and a process that is easily standardized. So components are standardized. We know what we are going to put into our cake. We also know that the outcomes are replicable, so if we follow the recipe, most of us can probably bake a cake and do that again the next time. So linear causation is assumed. And the question that we're really asking here is what works? So what works to bake a cake? What works to prevent injury? So if we look at an example of what I would say is a simple approach to injury prevention research is this sequence of prevention. So this is probably the one that we see most often in injury prevention research. And basically it's this idea of linear causation, A plus B equals C. So we take a population, we give them an injury prevention intervention, and then hopefully we would have better outcomes at the end. Often we don't, because we know that context then plays a big role. But this is what we usually use when we're talking about injury prevention research. So as I said, A plus B equals C, baking a cake. So Jason's mentioned that Nordic hamstring intervention, so the protocol that's super efficacious. We know that this works to prevent hamstring injuries. However, in the real world, we also know that it has not been uptaken by a lot of sports teams. So this is a really good example of a simple intervention. It's literally a protocol that uses basically this one exercise, yet elite sports teams are not using this intervention at all. And that's a really curious question that we come up against time and time again. Why are they not using what should be a really simple intervention? And for me, it's because we haven't taken into account any idea of what the context really is at a sports club. So there are lots of studies that have been done around why people are not using this intervention, but yet we aren't translating that into our practice. So again, simple approach is like baking a cake. Outcomes are replicable and linear causation is assumed. All right, then if we move to complicated approaches. So often people use the word complicated and complex as meaning the same thing. But if we're talking about complexity theory, they are really quite different things. So complex doesn't just mean very complicated. It's actually quite removed from complicated approaches. So complicated approaches, the example that I like to use here is it's like building a rocket. So components are still standardized, kind of like a simple approach, kind of like baking a cake. Outcomes are still largely replicable and linear causation is assumed, so we still have that idea of A plus B equals C. Yet this requires more sophisticated formulae and expertise. So more goes into building a rocket than baking a cake. And usually complicated approaches are subsets of simple problems and complicated relationships between those. So a complicated approach might contain subsets of simple and complicated approaches to create a whole. And so the question here, remember in simple approaches we said what works, so the question here becomes what works in context. So we're building a rocket and sending it up into space. We're adding in that element of context. So here's an example of a complicated approach. So this is the TRIP framework. And as you can see, the first 4 steps up there are the sequence of prevention that we had as a simple approach before. And then we have steps 5 and 6 here that add in the elements of context. So it adds in the more complicated outcomes or elements that lead to outcomes. So this is a good example here of a complicated approach. So as you can see at the top, we still have that hamstring lower, which we said was a simple approach to reducing injury. And it's now added in with other elements as well to create a more complicated program. So this is an example of the Footy First program that was developed for Australian rules football. So it's a lower limb injury prevention program. And again, this program has been shown to be super efficacious. We know that it works to prevent injury. And we also know that this program was taken out to community sports clubs. So elements of context were brought in to make this program more effective for them. So one example of that was this poster here. The original idea was to design the poster using elite Australian football players, showing what the exercises would be. But the community sports players said no, they would like to see community sports players doing the exercises in the posters. So that's really a simple idea of making it more applicable to the actual end user. So yeah, those are complicated approaches. We bring in elements of context, and yet we find that people are still not using those injury prevention programs as we would like them to use them. finally, we get to complex approaches. So the example here is complex approaches are like raising a child. So for any of you that may have children, you know that if you're raising two different children in the same household, you can do exactly the same thing with both children, and yet you'll have very different outcomes at the end. So two children might get the same upbringing, but they will end up being individual people. So formulae and prior experience are neither necessary nor sufficient. Sorry, that was a typo. I tried to fix that this morning. Obviously, I didn't say it. So neither necessary nor sufficient to outcomes. The whole is then seen as more than the sum of its parts. And the question here, so we had what works in context, and now we're moving it much further along to what works for whom, when, where, why, and how. So many more elements of context are being brought in when we're talking about complex approaches to injury prevention. So this was part of that BJSM paper where we started to bring in a language of being able to speak about how to approach complexity within sports settings. So really fun aspects like open systems and improbability and non-linearity. So complexity is really about becoming comfortable with really uncertain outcomes. And that's really difficult as a researcher because, as we said before, we want to know what works and funders want to know what works. But complexity is really about saying the world that we're working within is really uncertain and improbable and non-linear, and we need to find a language to be able to explain those outcomes. So this is just some new work that's been produced within sports injury prevention as well. So we have this really complex, what they call a web of determinants at the bottom. So all the different things that can go into an injury outcome or leading to an emerged injury outcome pattern. So that's just really exciting work that we're starting to work with now, rather than only going with training loads, for example. So just to recap very quickly, we have simple approaches like baking a cake. We have complicated approaches like building a rocket. And we have complex approaches like raising a child. So this isn't to say that simple and complicated approaches aren't useful. In fact, they can be super useful for a wide range of research questions, but it really depends on the research question that you are asking. So it's really important to go back and think about the lens that you're looking at the world with to see whether or not you need a complex approach rather than a simple approach to your research. All good. So one final little example here is another way to see the difference between complicated and complex. So this one I just read really recently was complicated approaches are like fixing a Ferrari. So now that you've heard all of that before, linear causation, etc., it's possible to fix a Ferrari. Whereas complex approaches are like fixing a rainforest. There is so much more happening when you need to fix a rainforest, starting with the tiniest little bug, going all the way up to climate change, right, that has an effect on fixing a forest. So you can't just plant a tree and think that the forest is going to be fixed. So that's just a really good way to remember the difference between complicated and complex. So this is the way that I always use complexity in my work. So rather than it being a model or a method or a metaphor, it's just a description of the way that the world is constructed. And that's the lens that I then always bring to my research. So I was just saying to Jason yesterday that I get a lot of flack from people because I'm primarily a qualitative researcher, and I get a lot of people saying to me, oh, but if you're a qualitative researcher, how can you use complexity theory in your work? Because I think a lot of people assume that complexity is all to do with systems, mathematical modeling, and really fancy computer programs. And those are methods for accounting for complexity. Whereas what I like to think about complexity as is this idea of a framework or lens that really informs the way that I approach my research. So that then means that there are many different methods that you can then employ within your research, as long as there is this frame of complexity of how the world is constructed as very complex rather than a simple system. Okay, final thing, and then I'm going to hand off back to you. So complexity, if we're thinking about this frame and this lens, it's really about the assumptions that we're making about the world. So the ways in which we are thinking about the world. So let's do this. Without overthinking, what does that say? ABC, right? Yes? Everyone got that? What does that say? Don't overthink.
It's 12, 13, 14.
Thank you, 12, 13, 14. But I'm sure you've noticed the lines or the symbols in the middle are exactly the same, right? So there it says ABC, there it says 12, 13, 14. So this is really about the context around that symbol in the middle. And that's really what complexity is. It's about taking into account the things that are going on around your interventions or around your context. Okay, this is a good example. We'll go to this one. So if I say my laptop is sick, what does that mean?
It's not working.
Okay, it's not working. My laptop is sick. It's about to die, right? What if I said to you that my dog's name is Laptop? Right, it changes things, right? My dog is sick now. Now I'm going to embarrass myself because I'm so not cool enough to do this. What if I said, my laptop is sick? You know what I mean? Like I have a cool laptop, basically. So again, the way that I see things, the way that I read things might be very different from the way that other people read things. And that's the same for an intervention or for a context or for your piece of research. It's really important to take into account the context around how your research is perceived, or to take into account the lens in which different people account for the world. Okay, this one's a similar idea. John read the letter to Mary. What does that mean?
Someone called John read out a letter to someone called Mary.
There we go. So someone called John read out a letter to someone called Mary. So if we play around a little bit with grammar and things like that here, what if we capitalize the letter? So we said John read the letter to Mary. We could kind of say then that the letter is the name of a book, for example. So John read a book called The Letter to Mary. Right? There are so many different ways of interpreting this. We could capitalize everything, the letter to Mary, so the book's name could be The Letter to Mary. Right? So John read a book called The Letter to Mary. Any other interpretations here?
You can make it a command. You can say, John, read the letter to Mary.
There we go. So we can say, John, read the letter to Mary. We could also construct this as the letter being like a single letter, like the letter T. So John is maybe teaching a child, reading the letter T to Mary, right? Okay, so that's really what complexity is. It's about thinking about different lenses, about different ways of constructing the world around us, and using that as a framework or a scaffold for our research. And in that way, we then have more of a language to be able to explain the uncertain outcomes that we sometimes see, or the outcomes that might not be replicable, for example. So context always matters when you're doing research, and it's always important to take that into account.
All right, so thank you for, like I said, it's a far more articulate explanation of complexity theory than what I could have done. But what I want to do now is try and bring this back to the concept of injury prevention. And I think that the issue that we've got with injury prevention, we know that it's, in theory, it works in certain contexts, but it's poorly adopted. So why is that? And I'd say that probably the injury prevention solutions that we've provided so far are somewhere on the category from simple to complicated, but generally aren't complex. And so what that means is that we get singular solutions, either simple solutions or complicated solutions, but they're meant to be used in a wide variety of contexts. And that creates this problem. The Ferraris are nice, But if you try and create a solution that can be used in forests, on race courses, on a lake, and on a mountaintop, what you get is something that tries to be all things to all people. So we get a hovercraft. And the thing is that hovercrafts are neither cool, nor sexy, nor particularly good in any of those environments, but are probably usable in all of them. And if you take a person that's working in any one of these environments and ask them what vehicle they would like to use, they probably don't envisage a hovercraft first. Because the only person that this vehicle is useful to is someone that needs to transition across all of these environments. And we don't see that very, very often. So this is the problem with our current injury prevention research. It attempts to be all things to all people. And the reason why it can't be all things to all people is injury prevention solutions that we've seen so far are developed for a particular context. But these contexts are so dynamic because every single context is different. It depends on the athletes that are in it, the team that they function within, the coaches of that team, the league structure within that falls within, and maybe even larger social influences within that. And all of those things interact to create different sort of contexts for the individuals within those teams. So it becomes absolutely impossible to, one, describe every single context in which an injury prevention intervention might be implemented, but also the assumption that we can prove that something works in one context and then transfer that to another is completely false. You know, every single time we try to create a solution in a new context, there needs to be new learning that takes place in order to try and facilitate that. The second problem that we've got in terms of finding solutions that work in context is that our contexts are continually changing. There's no such thing as a static context. So I'll bring you a couple of examples over here. So in terms of rugby, Lombard in 2015 showed that there's been a 20% increase in body mass and strength of international under-20 rugby players in the last 12 years. So what that's saying is that if you developed an injury prevention program for those players 10 years ago, it's no longer relevant. They're a different type of animals now. They are way bigger and stronger than they were at the time when that process was effective. The other thing that we see is in Premier League football, the amount of high-speed running that the players engage in has increased by 30% in 7 years and continues to increase. So what we're seeing is that the stresses placed on the athletes within those environments are changing and evolving. So we need systems that have the ability to change and evolve along with them. So to maybe reiterate something that Sheree said earlier, we've got to avoid trying to find final solutions or singular solutions, and we've got to stop saying, well, what's going to work? And we've got to start saying what works for whom, when, where, why, and how. And probably that understanding of why something works in a particular place at a particular time is the really useful knowledge. Because if we can avoid trying to build hovercrafts and start saying, well, what happens in each of these environments? How can I be successful here? How can I be successful here? How can I be successful here? And provide that knowledge to a user that then needs to go into a new and unique environment. He can leverage the learnings or the previous experiences of people who've been successful in those environments to learn how to be successful again in a new, unique context. So this creates a little bit of challenge in terms of how do we go about doing these things, because our current processes have been different, have not been successful. So we now need to think a little bit about how we can use complexity science, how we can use implementation science to go forward and produce better solutions.
Thank you. Yeah, so that becomes the real question. And if we have complexity as our framework or our lens or the way that we're scaffolding both our work and the context that our work is conducted within, how do we then do this? What are the methods for accounting for that? How do we conduct our research? And for me, as I said before, I'm a qualitative researcher, and you can really apply any methods to this as long as you've scaffolded your work in that way. But this paper here just came out earlier this year, and it's really, really useful in thinking through those questions about, okay, which methods to use now, how do we conduct this research? So I'll just give one example very quickly. One of the really good tables that they have in this paper is this comparison of implementation science and complexity science. So the way that they have constructed it here is implementation science kind of being the normal, regular way of doing science. So usually the simple or complicated approaches, with then complexity as the new way of doing things. So for example, if we have a very specific task, so for example, getting evidence into clinical practice. So we have a research intervention and we now want to get that into practice in the real world. That's a really general implementation science kind of research question. How do we bridge that gap between science and practice? Whereas complexity science will then say, as we've said a few times today, that the task really is context dependent. And so we can apply different elements of complexity into that task. And so how we integrate those two is to take tailored solutions and iterative processes. So I don't want any of you to think that we are advocating brand new injury prevention programs for every single context, because of course there are lessons that we can take from different contexts and just tweak them and apply them to new contexts. So there is some iterative work that's then done to make it more relevant to that context. So a good example of this, funnily enough, is the paper that Jason and I worked on before with this rugby paper. So what we did was we took that sequence of prevention. So remember I said that was our general simple approach of doing injury prevention research. So we used that because it is still a useful framework for doing research within. And we added this iterative process to it. So we just took what was that sequence of prevention and explained how it was used. Maybe you can talk a little bit to that.
Yeah, so I suppose the outcome of the study, first of all, is, to my knowledge, this is the only study in the research that has shown a reduction of injury in professional rugby players in a single team context. So there's it's probably the only one that's shown that, because it's quite a difficult thing to do. It was quite a dynamic group of people that we were working with. But essentially they started following the steps of the sequence of prevention, probably because we didn't have a lot of knowledge of complexity theory at that stage. So they measured what their injury problem was. They worked out that it was a pretty bad problem. And then they put a couple of mechanisms in action to try and address that. But then where this starts becoming something linked to complexity theory is they didn't do what injury prevention researchers often do, is say, well, there's our solution, we've done it, we leave it there. They assessed what the effects of were that in the context. And interestingly enough, in the short term, things actually got worse, because they tried things, they'd upset this complex system, and the injury outcomes became worse. But what was really important about this was there were very important learnings from that process, and they started working out what injury prevention solutions that they'd found from a range of sources were successful in that environment. And over the course of a number of seasons, following through this iterative cycle, they started realizing what interventions should be included and what things should be removed in that environment to tailor that injury prevention solution to that environment. And ultimately, that aligns with what we're saying, because complexity theory tells us that the outcomes are not always predictable, because they are at times influenced by things that we can't measure or are beyond our control. But it also gives us the understanding that by working through iterative processes and repeating this process over and over again, we can eventually fit an intervention that we know will work in that particular context.
So just going back to that paper, so we've done the task one. So that the table within that paper goes through all the different elements of a research process. So the theoretical assumptions and the intervention and the context. So it just gives some really good considerations for bringing complexity into your work. So I'm not going to go through all of those right now, but you can go and read that paper.
And then, just picking up from what we'd said in terms of our paper, recently this team sport injury prevention cycle has also been published, which is obviously very similar to the type of process that we described. And what I think is really interesting about this is that the authors of the paper describe how the processes, the sequence of prevention and the TRIP process are really useful for people researching injury prevention, but that this type of cycle is much more useful for people on the ground involved in injury prevention, because essentially this is what they're doing all the time. They're measuring their problem, they're using their professional expertise and knowledge from research to try and tailor interventions that will work best in their context, and then they're measuring the outcomes of those interventions, learning from that and applying that again. So I borrowed a term from psychological research, which is this idea of being ipsative. So you can't prove that an injury prevention program works unless you're comparing to what it was like before that in that context. So we can't take an injury prevention program that works with Nigerian 17-year-old footballers and apply it in one of Stacey's Super League clubs, because those contexts are too different from each other. Well, what we need to understand is, if we're going to show that something works, is we've got to apply it in the context of the Super League club and then try and...
You need to do the firearm test on this one today.
Right now?
Yeah.
There's a great example of complexity there.
Yeah. Okay. We'll probably be done in about 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Yeah. Thanks.
So just all five then. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So essentially, proving that
You
things
can't
work.
control your context, right? Stuff happens.
Injury prevention solutions only become useful to practitioners once they work in the context that they are meant to work in.
And the thing is with all of this is that if it sounds really common sense and really pragmatic, it really just is. Like I always find it funny that people find complexity so, such a scary big concept, when all of this is really pragmatic, common sense kind of research, and yet our research systems are not designed to deal with this uncertainty very well. And so it is a bit of a process to get there.
And then the last point that I wanted to make from this is that thus far, injury prevention research has largely been top-down. So we get some bigwigs in the university, they design an intervention and they say, there you go forth and conquer. And the truth is that if we're going to account for complexity theory, it probably needs to be bottom up. What we need is people who are working in practice using that cycle of prevention and reporting that back to us, so that we start to understand what works in a broad range of contexts, and then we can become like that guy in the middle of the different contexts and pick and choose the information that is most relevant to you and your environment, and then use that to design your intervention from there. And what that means is that we probably, if we're going to hit this problem on the head, is we've got to become multi-site. We can't just prove that something works in one context. We've got to learn how it works across a range of contexts, and practitioners are going to be hugely involved in this, because they're the ones with the on-the-ground expertise. Do we need to evacuate?
No.
There we go. That's all I have to say about that.
You're done.
Yeah.
All right. Finally, let's then think a little bit about the implications of this. So what can you take away from today, and how can you apply this to your research? So the implications really here are that complexity research is, we can use mixed methods approaches. We can use qualitative and quantitative approaches. We need to account for the fluid nature of interventions, but also of the contexts, as Jason said. So be comfortable with the idea that things are changing all of the time, and know that research has this really long arc, and we're often missing the change that happens quite rapidly within a context itself. We need to recognize that interventions have power in and of themselves as well. So applying an intervention into a context naturally changes the context too. So that's something that's often written out of our research reports, but the intervention can have an effect. So an example of that is I've seen in CCTV kind of research. So if there is, for example, some crime happening in an area, then they will put CCTV into that area. But that doesn't mean that the crime disappears, right? It means that crime either moves to a different area or criminals become more clever and subvert that CCTV in that space. So we need to be aware of that happening within sports research too. Identify interactions between the different elements. So that might be within an intervention or between interventions and the context. And recognize that patterns do emerge, and that's really the thing that we're dealing with here, is different patterns that we can then apply across different contexts. And then, as Jason mentioned in the paper that we worked on, these were kind of the implications that we came up with there. So the ability to evolve, learn, and adapt is both necessary and desirable within intervention research. That positive impacts may take time. So as we said, that in that paper, the intervention that was applied actually had really negative outcomes for, I think it was 3 years before we started to see positive research, or positive outcomes. So that is an important takeaway as well, important lesson from that research. And then the system may self-regulate. So we've put something into that system, it changes the system or the context in and of itself, but then it does tend to self-regulate over time as the context changes. So being comfortable with those hidden or unforeseen outcomes is really important. So complexity science, in a nutshell, is vast and broad, and there are many different ways of dealing with complexity. But for me, the real takeaway or the real thing to focus on here is that complexity never gives you answers. In fact, it always leaves you with more considerations than answers. But that's okay, and it's fine to deal with that uncertainty in our research. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's everything.
Yeah, jump in.
Okay, thank you to obviously both Jason and Sheree for that very sort of thought-provoking presentation. We've probably got up to about 15 minutes for any questions, if anyone has any.
Really enjoyed that, guys. I think the question for you, Jason, you were saying it needs to be kind of multi-site, multi-project potentially, so even in the same sport, we can have different outcomes through the same intervention. But how does that, I suppose, is the challenge of getting around the reluctance to publish what people see as kind of replication studies? So if we publish something from 2 different rugby clubs using the same intervention, they might argue that's a replication, but actually the context is very different, so the outcomes may be different.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. In fact, one of the things that we're working on at the moment is probably a literature review that points out those tensions between what sort of research is valued versus what we actually need as practitioners. There is a bit of more of a move in the world towards understanding the value of replication studies because, exactly that, there is value in knowing that, understanding why one intervention worked in one context and not in the other. I think that the other thing that we've got to do here is we've got to get away from mean centering everything. We've got to get away from the average. So typically what we'd see in terms of epidemiological studies is, we'd report the average amount of injuries or the average incidence of injuries for a league, which is interesting in itself, but I think what's really interesting is that within that average, there will be clubs that have really low injury incidence and clubs that have really high injury incidence, and going in there and finding out what's going right in those clubs that are being successful from that and what's not going right in the other ones is particularly rich areas of data for us to learn about how to deal with these problems.
I also think something that's important to note there is the paradigm of research that we're working within. So a replication study is really useful for drug research, for example, but it's not really useful in human interventions, I think, because exactly as you say, like there are new things that we're learning, right, from that intervention, even if it's done, similarly, another time. So thinking about the paradigm of research and the more philosophical questions around that, around is that research study design really useful? And how it's then written up makes a difference, I think, to really centre it away from a replication type study to maybe an implementation science-based study. Changes things quite a lot. Yeah, that's a good question. I like it.
I was just wondering, how did you get a club to stick with you for 3 years if you were getting negative results?
Well, they weren't my results, they were their results for a start.
Your framework, was it, were they were working through, presumably, under your guidance, was it? Or?
Well, no, it wasn't my guidance. So what I provided with them, for them, was a mechanism. They already sensed that they probably had a problem with injuries. So what we did was we provided data for them, which essentially, first of all, benchmarked them against other clubs. But then within that, you delve a little bit deeper, and you can start saying, well, loads of your injury burden comes from these particular areas. So one of the examples that's in the paper was during the first year they had a disproportionate number of non-contact injuries. More than 50 or almost 50% of the injury burden was coming from non-contact injuries. So that presented the first target for intervention. How can we change processes in the club to reduce non-contact injuries? Now, what happened as a result of that is that we did reduce non-contact injuries. So they had players available for selection more often. Players were on the field more often. So what that does is it increases your exposure to well, it was a rugby club, so your exposure to being tackled, which had a knock-on effect. It increased the number of contact injuries that they experienced. So you see how these complex systems sort of evolve. So the reason why they stuck with us, I guess, was because even though we were tracking overall injury outcomes, we could show improvements in certain areas, and we maintained the things that showed those improvements, and we changed other things to try and get improvements in the areas that were maybe red flags for us, and over time came up with a solution that was pretty successful.
I think what's important to note is it wasn't an intervention that was or a research study that was designed for that, right? It was just what they were naturally doing in the club anyway, being tracked. And then this complexity stuff was applied after to write it up. So I came in right at the end and was like, ooh, how are we going to write this thing up? And so this kind of language was really useful to say, yeah.
I really enjoyed that. It was really interesting. One thing from a performance point of view is everything you talked about is a complex. It's about reducing injuries, but not everything we do in training is about reducing injuries. So it's more of a question: how do you kind of embed improving performance and adapting to kind of reducing injuries at the same time?
Yeah, so I guess the best way to ensure you don't get injured is to stay in bed, isn't it? Which probably doesn't do a lot for your sport-specific performance. So yeah, and that is part of the complex system. So the need to develop players physically, what are the types of pressures that the coaches are under, things like that. All of these things interact. So once again, you changing things within the system, because it ultimately comes back to a set point. The outcome emerges as a result of all of those things. So yeah, you could argue that being well prepared for your sport physically reduces injury, but there's probably you can work too hard to be well prepared, and then that drives your injury risk up. So I guess again, in terms of trying to balance that out, you need this feedback process, this feedback loop where you can always assess what you're doing back against your previous outcomes, so that you can try and find the best fit for that environment.
And I think injury prevention has like a PR problem, right? We're so used to talking about injury prevention, but I think coaches, or what I've heard before, and high performance people don't want to talk about injury because that's like focusing on the negative thing. They want to talk about increasing performance, or we can talk about health promotion rather than injury prevention, right? So that was some of my PhD research was talking to stakeholders like that to find out how should we be targeting this idea of injury prevention, and yeah, that came up time and time again. So try to move from injury prevention to this idea of injury prevention is performance enhancement, or as performance enhancement, because then your players are more available to participate, so or to train or to whatever. Yeah.
I've got one for you. So in terms of getting governing bodies or clubs, etc., if we're looking for them to fund research like this, sort of, what are your sort of experience or thoughts on how we go about that, where they're almost expecting that if they're providing that funding, we're almost providing the answers, where, you know, as you presented, it's more not quite as black and white as maybe what they're looking for.
I was just saying to Jason, that's the question that comes up time and time and time again, because it's a really valid question, especially as a researcher. So what I started doing is taking examples from where this has been applied in other research areas, so in nursing and in heart failure research, and they've really moved beyond this question of, you know, what works and the simple interventions and complicated interventions. So taking a lot of the language from those spaces to show that, you know, or just to explain that contexts are so different, and that we really need to tap into that uncertainty. But yeah, I don't know yet. I don't have the answer to that. I don't know if you have any.
I'm at a loss. I just think that, you know, as scientists, it's very dangerous to position ourselves as the people who have the answers, and that sometimes that's expected of us. But, you know, right at the beginning phase of that planning, it should probably be a case of, well, we'll help you know more about this, but at the end of the day, it's still going to be shades of grey. It probably will never be black and white.
And I guess that's also a philosophical thing, is that's why we have the replication crisis, right? Is because our paradigms of research aren't suited to the kinds of research questions that we're asking. That's like a massive issue. So to show that research isn't relevant anyway, we should be doing it differently, that's maybe a way into that. Using other crises, like the crisis in evidence-based healthcare and so on. That's a good conversation to tap into.
You mentioned there around the importance of multi-method, and that's generally quite paradigm spanning, actually, in terms of then some of the underpinning philosophies around it. Just interested in the reading that you've been doing, in what kind of methods do you think we're likely to be applying to really bring this complexity theory to life through the research that we undertake?
So something that I've become really interested in recently is critical realism, and so realist methods I think could be super useful in this space. So yeah, that's why I'm going up next week for a course in that. So that's my idea of where we should be going with this. I find that to be super useful, I think, but I'm still learning, so yeah.
I mean, my take on that is a little bit. I was saying to Sheree this morning, Johan Wintz recently published a paper looking at all of the kind of training load and links to injuries, but it's really a qualitative paper, because what it says is, what is our theory behind the link between training load and injury, and if injuries are complex and multifactorial, why are we applying simple statistical techniques? Why are we using t-tests when we need to apply statistical techniques that can account for all of these factors that contribute? So I think that one of the things that we've got to do, whether it's going to be qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods, is that we've got to get a lot more alignment between the techniques we're using and the theoretical paradigms that we're starting with at the start of research.
So my work actually involves applying critical realism to understanding.
Yeah, I've heard.
So pretty much everything you said I completely agree with, and I think that critical realism does provide a bit more of a robust philosophical framework for understanding complexity than complexity theory would be my view.
Yeah.
That's just a point, so I would encourage you to keep going down that line of attack. But another point I suppose, or maybe a point to consider or a question, is you try to make a link between the research framework you've developed and what it says about the fundamental structure of the world, and then how we use the information it generates, and you talk about the use of implementation science and so on. It always seems to me to be quite a nice symmetry between the world described by the frameworks that you've described, this kind of idea of kind of multiple variables all interacting, lots of stuff hidden underneath the surface you can't account for.
Yeah.
And I think you described that very well. And expertise research, which just basically says that kind of experts make judgment either through kind of very explicit thoughts or intuitively, with the kind of recognition recognition of these multifactorial things going on, but they don't really understand, they can't really articulate why.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that, I think you made the point something about understanding, I can't remember the exact language in regard to tailored solutions and iterative processes. But I think research experts kind of do that intuitively.
Yeah. So there's that really good paper about guidelines and mind lines. So I think this is research with surgeons, and so where we know that surgical guidelines aren't necessarily always super effective. They actually add to the burden of work that they need to do. And then there was this really good qualitative work that was done where they kind of it was some teasing out of what they then called mind lines that surgeons work. They just do this intuitively, like from experience and expertise. So I think that's what you're speaking to, the kind of deeper processes that kind of.
Yeah, but they have to be experts rather than just blind appliers of simple processes.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, just on that way, one of the papers I read recently about why coaches aren't adopting some of these things is, it just said the coaches don't see how that injury prevention program is going to be more beneficial than what they're currently doing, which kind of says that probably they're already considering these things and have a strategy, and we haven't demonstrated that what we're offering them is better than the strategy that's based on their own expertise. So why would they adopt it?
If I can just make a final point, is why would we ever expect that things would go right all the time?
Good point.
Things go wrong all the time.
Yeah.
And each one was, I hate to say these terms, it's just like kind of down this limitation involved in just trying to find very, very localised, tailored solutions to very, very localised, tailored problems.
And we can learn from it, from when things go wrong as well. Those are good lessons, but yeah.
Okay, I think we're probably out of time there, so we can just thank Jason and Sheree again for their
Thank you.